Rabbi, we are in the very bottom of Nunan Bebeis. We're going to skip a few. I know that yesterday you didn't get to the bottom of the Amud, but we are going to go. And I apologize. You'll have to make it up. The reason is because we just don't have enough time to do justice to those last 4 lines. But we are going to start with the words Omar Rava. And I want to make it very clear that there are 2 yesodos, 2 fundamental issues, that as long as you have these fundamental issues clear in your head, then despite the confusion that is presented in this DAF, it'll become very clear. The first principle is again, it's not difficult. The first principle is that there's a machlokas between Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim regarding get achar get and ma'amar achar ma'amar. Right? In other words, there are 2 Yevamos that fall to a man to Yibum. In other words, a guy, Reuven dies, he leaves over 2 wives. And Shimon gives one a get, and he gives the second one a get. Or he gives the first a mimer, and he gives the second one a mimer. According to Rabbi Gamliel, the second of the same thing means absolutely nothing. And the Gemara is going to explain why Rabbi Gamliel holds that way. But the point is that Rabbi Gamliel says, once you did a get in the first one, the second get that you give to the second one means absolutely nothing, such that you're allowed to marry that girl's relatives. And the same thing will be true if you give a second mimer to the second Yevama, it means absolutely nothing. Okay? The Chachamim disagree, and they say no. A get partially affects the first one and partially affects the second one, even though both get and mimer are rabbinic mechanisms that don't really work midioraisa in the context of Yibum, but nevertheless you've stigmatized both women, and therefore, once you've gotten yourself out of this mess, right, which means that you're going to have to give a get, you gave a get to one and a get to another, you're going to have to give chalitza to one of them, but it doesn't matter which one you give chalitza to, according to the Chachamim, you're going to be usher to both of their relatives. Okay, so that's Yesod number 1, the machlokas between Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim regarding get achar get and mimer achar mimer. The second fundamental is something that was addressed by the Mishnah yesterday, which is when you have 3 Yevamas fall to you for Yibum. When you have 3 Yevamas fall to you for Yibum, and then you do to A, you got A, B, and C. Okay, just to make it simple. You give A a get, you do Bia with B, B for Bia, right? That makes sense, right? And then C, you give a mimer. Or you just reverse the mimer and the get. You give A get, B, Bia, and C a mimer. So either the first one gets a mimer and the last one gets a get, or if the first one gets a get and the last one gets a mimer. In that case, there's no disagreement between Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim. They both agree that you've stigmatized all 3 of these women, such that you're usher to all 3 of their relatives through the contact that you've made, either through get, bia, and mimer. Now the reason is, and you could argue, well listen, if I did bia with B, so then what else is there left to do? I've done a full-blown yibum. The answer is that it's a weekund, it's called a bia pagum. In some way, it's become a tainted bia because it was preceded by either a get or a mimer to another yevama. So even though midioraisa, you've done real yibum to that woman, but you've weakened it in some sense, and therefore there's still room for a get or a mimer to the third one, midorabanan. That's all part of the Takanas Chachamim. Now, if you have that idea straight, and you have our machlokas between Gamliel and the Chachamim straight, it's smooth sailing from here on in. Okay, the point is that those are the 2 yesodos that you need to get straight. Okay, and once you got those 2 points straight, you're a-okay. Omar Rava. So the last 2 words of Nun Amid Beis is my time de Rabbi Gamliel. What is Rabbi Gamliel's reasoning for saying that ein get achar get ve'ein mimer achar mimer? De misafgale. The answer is that Rabbi Gamliel really isn't sure what the efficacy of either a get or a mimer in the context of Yibum is. Get idachi ilo dachi, mimer ikani ilo kani. He's not sure whether a get has the ability to deflect or not, or whether a mimer has the ability to acquire or not. A get creates severance, and a mimer creates an acquisition. but to what degree does it? He's not sure if it creates the severance or not, or if it creates the acquisition or not. So he looks at it this way. I dachi ilo dachi, I kama dachi basra mai ka'avid. He says, look at it like this. If a get creates a severance between you and the first Yevama, so he says, I kama dachi, so if I've created a severance with the first one, so basra mai ka'avid, so then I've already accomplished my obligations to this family, and therefore my actions to the second one are completely inconsequential. And therefore, what I gave is a meaningless piece of paper to her. It wasn't even a get, and therefore it doesn't affect my relationship with her relatives. And if a get doesn't create a severance at all in this case of Yevama, so then I haven't done anything to either A or to B. And therefore, according to Rabbi Gamliel, you basically say Miman Avshach. No matter how you look at a get, either it creates a severance or it doesn't create a severance at all. In either way, what I've done to the second Yevama is completely meaningless. And the same thing with a mimer. Mimer ikani ilokani. He says he's not sure. Does a mimer create an acquisition, a marriage, or not? He says, ikama kani basra maikav. If the mimer creates a marriage, creates a yibum, so then I'm doing something meaningless to the second Yevama, because you can only be kaina one Yevama, you can't be kona two. V'ikama lokani basra nami lokani. And if the mimer doesn't work at all, so then it works neither for the first or the second. So no matter how you look at it, whatever you're doing for the second woman is completely inconsequential. So Esvei Abaye. So Abaye now challenges this. He says, Umoda Rabbi Gamliel. Now this is the second yesod that I told you to keep in mind. The case of three women who fall to Yibum, right? Umoda Rabbi Gamliel sheyesh get acher maimer umaimer acher haget. V'get acher bia umaimer acher bia v'get. Now, the Mishnah had told us, actually this is not the Mishnah, but this is really in the same context of our Mishnah, but this is back on DAF Chav Zayin, that Rabbi Gamliel agrees that a get can be given after a mimer, meaning that if I give a mimer, I can give B a get, and that get has consequences, and vice versa. And he also agrees that if I give, let's say there are three Yevamas, and I give A get, B bia, and C a mimer, then that C's action, the actions to C are consequential. So the question that he asks is, V'i mesafka le Rabbi Gamliel tihabi kibia delichatchila v'tikni. He says, I don't understand. If Rabbi Gamliel is not sure what a mimer does and what a get does, and he either creates a severance or doesn't create a severance, so then let's think about it. Mimon avshach. If a get creates severance, so then he's done a full chalitza to A. His bia with B is completely inconsequential, and therefore so too is his actions to C. So if he gives a mimer to C, that act of mimer to C should be completely inconsequential. And if a get doesn't work at all, so then the bia that he does with B should be a full-blown yibum. It should be a full-blown yibum, in which case he's done full yibum, and therefore whatever he gives to C shouldn't count. So basically the Gemara's argument is, Abaye's argument to Rava is, if you're looking at a get and a mimer as a suffix that it's either completely on or completely off, so in a case of A, B, and C, so when you give a get to A, by the time, and you give bia to B, by the time you get to C, it shouldn't create any consequences to C whatsoever, whatever you give her, whether you give her a get or a mimer. That's the Gemara's question. And the Hatnan, because the Mishnah says, Habe'ila bisman shehi batchila, ein acharei klum. Because if you're looking at the get as completely nothing, then he's doing bia with B as the first woman that he's giving anything of substance to. And anytime you do anything after bia, after a full bia for yibum, it's completely meaningless. And so therefore it doesn't really make any sense why Rabbi Gamliel should agree to such a case. Ela Omer Abaye. So the only way to make sense of it, says Abaye, is that Rabbi Gamliel is not a suffix. It's not that he has a suffix whether a get is completely on or completely off, and a mimer is completely on or completely off, but rather La'olam Pshita Leila Rabbi Gamliel beget dedachi u'mimer dekani. Rabbi Gamliel has no suffix. He knows that a get creates a severance, but only a limited severance. And he also knows for sure that a mimer creates a kinyan, but only a partial kinyan. Mihu Amar Rabbanan hayavama b'chad sad mahani baget uv'chad sad mahani ba mimer. But he says when it comes to a yavama, a get only helps partially, and a mimer only helps partially. It's not a complete severance, and it's not a complete acquisition. And therefore, get acher get lo dachi, dahadacha lekama. And the way, therefore, that Rabbi Gamliel looks at it is, a get has certain severance power. But whatever severance power it has already been exhausted when you give a get to the first yavama. By the time you get to the second yavama, the get power in this household has been completely exhausted on the first. And therefore, when you give her a get to the second one, it's a completely insignificant piece of paper. And the same thing, there's a kinyan power to a mimer. But that kinyan power only works to the household of Yevamas to a limited degree. Once you've given the mimer to the first woman, the mimer power on this household is completely exhausted, so that by the time you give a mimer to the second woman, it's completely inconsequential. That's the way Rabbi Gamliel looks at it. Not that it's a suffix, but rather he knows exactly what the mechanism of get and mimer is for a Yevama. It has limited power, and once you've used it once, you cannot use it. It has no power to be used on the second Yevama in the household. Umaimer achar maimer lokani, dahakani lekama. And therefore, for the same reason, giving a mimer after the first mimer has completely no power. However, this is the difference. Get achar mimer, umaimer achar get. He says, but let's say you mix and match. Let's say you give the first one a mimer and the second one a get, or vice versa. He says, Hai milsa kadachi, vai milsa kakani. He says, that's where there's a difference. He says, there Rabbi Gamliel acknowledges that you can have a consequence to giving A mimer and B a get and vice versa. Because there are two different powers that are at work here. And therefore, by giving a mimer to A and then giving a get to B, both women are affected by the limited powers of the mimer and the get. That's the difference. V'Rabbanan. The Rabbanan who argue with Rabbi Gamliel and they say there is a mimer after a mimer and there is a get after a get, they say Kol chad v'chad takinu le Rabbanan. That you don't look at the household as receiving a get, or the household as receiving a mimer, like Rabbi Gamliel does, but you look at each Yevama as having the ability to receive a get or a mimer, and both a get and a mimer have limited power. Get umimer biyavama, v'hai biya pesula, get umimer biyavama. Right, so kol chad v'chad takinu le Rabbanan, get umimer biyavama. So the Chachamim allow for both a get and a mimer to befall each Yevama separately, and that's why they'll say that just because you gave a mimer doesn't weaken the mimer's efficacy to B, and the same thing by a get. Now, let's take a look now at a case where there's A, B, and C, where you gave a mimer to A, Bia to B, and a get to C, or you switch mimer and get, that you gave the get to A and the mimer to C. But in both of those cases, Rabbi Gamliel acknowledges that the bia is a compromised bia, and therefore whatever you give to C will be consequential. He explains like this: V'hai bia pesula adifa mimaimer ugriya mimaimer. He says like this. He says, according to Rabbi Gamliel, he says bia, compromised bia, what we call a bia pesula, because it comes after a get or after a mimer to another yevama, is a third kind of power, right? And therefore, when you mix and match all three, then each one has efficacy. So therefore, the way it works is that the bia pesula is in some ways a stronger power than a mimer, and in other ways it's weaker than a mimer. Adifa mi mimer, it's stronger than a mimer, meaning de'ilu mimer achar mimer lo mahani, v'ilu bia achar mimer mahani. Because in one sense it's stronger than a mimer, in other words, it has more power, because according to Rabbi Gamliel, when you give one mimer after a previous mimer, the second mimer is completely inconsequential. But bia after a mimer, you give a mimer and you give B bia, so that bia is consequential to B. So you see that bia after a mimer is because it has more power than a mimer after a mimer. But in what sense is it ugriya mi mimer? In what sense is it weaker than a mimer? De'ilu mimer achar haget kani lekule shiura de get. He says when you give a mimer after a get, let's say you give A a mimer, you give A get and you give B a mimer. In that case, Rabbi Gamliel holds that there's nothing left to do with C. If you give C anything, either a get or a mimer, then it's completely inconsequential. He says, Kani lekule shiur de get, v'ilu bia acher haget, lo kanya le lekule shiur de get. But if you give bia after you gave a get to A, and then you gave bia to B, you haven't completely exhausted anything to be done to C. To C, you could give a mimer or a get, and it'll still have an effect, it'll still have a consequence to her, to us or her relatives to you. So therefore, what the Gemara is basically just speaking out is that there are three different powers that Rabbi Gamliel acknowledges do not negate each other. Get, mimer, and bia pesula. And all three have a weakened, limited power of either severance or acquisition. A bia pesula is really very similar to a mimer in that it has limited acquisition power, but it's different from a mimer as well, such that if you gave a mimer to one and you gave bia to the second, it's not like a mimer acher mimer where it doesn't mean anything. Bia after a mimer does mean something. And not only that, but even though you gave both a mimer to the first one and a get to the second one, a mimer to the first one and bia to the second one, if you give a get to the third one, that also is going to be consequential. Okay, let us go weiter. Tana Rabbana. The Brisa now says, Keitzad Omar Rabban Gamliel en get achar get. Let's explain in detail in what sense that Rabban Gamliel says that there's no such thing as a get after a get. Shtei Yevamos shenafu lifnei yavam echad v'nasan get lezu v'get lezu. Two Yevamos were married to Ruvain. They both fall before Shimon for Yibum. He gives a get to A and he gives a get to B. So Rabban Gamliel oimer choletz l'rishana v'aser b'krovoseha umuter b'krovos shenia. Rabbi Gamliel says the second get that you gave to B is completely inconsequential, and therefore all you need to do is give A chalitza, and then your relationship with B, or we should say rather B's relatives, is perfectly fine, because you haven't had any contact with B other than the fact that she's an Eishasach, and therefore you're allowed to marry her relatives. V'chachamim omrim nasan get lezu v'get lezu aser b'krovos shtehen b'chalitza le'echas mehen. And the Chachamim disagree, and they say no. If you give a get acher get, you give a get to A and get to B, they've both been in some way connected and severed by that get, and therefore just like you're usher to A's relatives, you're usher to B's relatives as well. V'cheina ta'omer b'shnei yevamim v'yevama echas. And not only is this true when two Yevamas fall before one Yavam, but it's also true when one Yevama falls before two brothers who are Yevamim, who want to perform the act of Yibum. If each one would give a get, then both of them would be usher according to the Chachamim to her relatives, and according to Rabban Gamliel, only the first one would be usher. Now the Brisa continues and it says, Keitzad Amar Rabban Gamliel ein mimer acher mimer, very similar to the Reisha. In what instance does Rabban Gamliel say there's no such thing as a mimer after a mimer? Shtei Yevamos shenafu lifnei yavam echad. Two Yevamas fall before one Yavam, before Shimon. V'yasa mimer bezu, a mimer bezu. And Shimon gives A mimer and he gives B a mimer. Rabban Gamliel Omer nosen gate la rishana v'choletz la v'asa b'krovoseha umuter b'krovo shnia. So here too, Rabban Gamliel says the mimer that you gave to B is completely inconsequential, and therefore you gave a mimer to A. We're going to tell you give her chalitza, and then you're completely severed from her. You actually have to give her a get and chalitza, because a mimer always necessitates a get, so you have to give her a get and chalitza, and then you're not allowed to marry her relatives. However, the second woman doesn't need any remedy, because what you gave her, the mimer that you gave her, is completely nothing, and you're also mutter to marry her relatives. V'chachamim omrim nosein get lishteihem ve'oser bikrovo shteyen v'chalitza le'echos mehen. And the Chachamim disagree, and they say no. A mimer to A and a mimer to B is consequential for both of them. You have to give a get to each one and chalitza to one of them. It doesn't really matter which one. And then you're going to be usher to both women's relatives. And finally, the Brisa says, just like by a get, we said it's true both with two Yevamas and one Yavam, and one Yevama and two men, two brothers. So too will the same apply to the case of Maimer. That's the end of the Brisa, and now we're going to analyze the Brisa. Amar Mar, no saying get lazu v'get lazu. So you have to give a get to, or nasan get lazu v'get lazu. If you give a get to each one, what did we say according to Rabbi Gamliel? We said Rabbi Gamliel omer choletz la rishona v'aser b'krovoseha umuter b'krovos shenia. According to Rabbi Gamliel, the get only works to the first Yevama, and it's completely inconsequential to the second, and therefore you only need to give chalitza to the first, and the second one you're allowed to marry her relatives. Lema tihavi tiyuf to do Shmuel, to Amar Shmuel, cholatz lebalas haget lo nifter atzara. This seems to be in refutation of Shmuel, at least Rabbi Gamliel's shita, and the Gemara in the Havamina feels that Shmuel is lekule alma. Shmuel goes according to everyone, both the Chachamim and Rabbi Gamliel. Now, what did Shmuel say? So it's important to understand this principle. Shmuel says that when you give chalitza, after you've already given just talk about one Yevama, okay? One Yevama falls to Yibum, and you've got a few brothers. You've got Shimon, Levi, etc. Shmuel is of the opinion that if Shimon goes ahead and before he does chalitza to her, he gives her a get, so we know what's the halacha. A get is not a valid chalitza, so you have to give her a chalitza after the get. However, Shmuel tells us a chiddush, and he says that because the chalitza is coming after a get, the chalitza is only creating a partial severance, because there was already a partial severance that was generated by the get that preceded it. And therefore, when she gets the chalitza from Shimon, it really doesn't completely remove the zika that's on her for the other brothers. Because the only time that chalitza removes the zika from the other brothers is if it's a full-blown chalitza. This is only a partial severance, or it's a weakened chalitza, and therefore, in order for her to be removed from the house, she's going to also have to get chalitza from Levi. It's a huge chiddush that Shmuel tells us, but conceptually it makes sense. Since Shimon's chalitza is a weakened chalitza because it was preceded by a get, she'll need to get chalitza from Levi as well. Now, if that's the case, I don't understand how Rabbi Gamliel can be consistent with that, because according to Rabbi Gamliel, there's no such thing if he gives a get to the first woman, and then he gives a get to the second woman, and he gives chalitza to the first woman, so you're telling me that it's completely inconsequential. What about the zika that still remains to the second brother? What about the chalitza that remains to the second brother, or the chalitza that remains to the, right? Because we had said that the same applies to two yavams and one yavama. So she says, so the Gemara now says, that the tzara needs to get another chalitza. In other words, not only when there's two yavams and one yavama, but when there's two yavamas, if he gives a get and then chalitza to one yavama, the second one still has to get chalitza because she's in a weakened position. Because in other words, the first chalitza was a weak chalitza, so it doesn't create severance for the second yavama. And yet you see from Rabbi Gamliel that even a chalitza that comes after a get completely absolves the second yavama. So Amar Lacha Shmuel ki Amri Ana Ali b'demanda Amar Yesh Zika v'Rabbi Gamliel Savar Ein Zika. So the Gemara's response is very simple. Shmuel will tell you, I'm not holding like Rabbi Gamliel. I'm talking about if you hold the shita of Yesh Zika, that Zika is a powerful substantive a palpable thing, and therefore, when you gave a weakened chalitza to one Yevama, it doesn't remove the zika from the second Yevama. You have to give her chalitza as well. But Rabbi Gamliel doesn't hold of the palpable nature of zika, and therefore he holds that once you gave chalitza, even if it was a weakened chalitza to the first Yevama, there's no obligation any further to the second Yevama. The Gemara now makes an assumption which we'll eventually see is not true. It would seem just by argument's logic, that if there's a machlokis in our Mishnah between Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim, if Rabbi Gamliel holds ein zika, which is why you don't have to give the second woman chalitza, then it would seem that the Rabbanan hold that yesh zika, uketani seifa, but this is our problem. If so, what about the seifa? V'chein ata omer b'shnei yavamim v'yavama echas. Because we say the same halacha is true with two yavams and one yavama, that according to the Chachamim, if the first brother gave a get and the second brother gave a get, then both brothers are usher to this girl's relatives. Lema tihavi tiyufta de Rabba Baravhuna Amar Rav Amar Rabba Baravhuna Amar Rav Chalitza pesula tzricha lachzor al kol ha'achin. This is the case that I was mentioning before, that if a woman gets a weakened chalitza because the first brother gave her a get and then he gave her chalitza, she has to get chalitza from the other brothers. But according to the Chachamim, you don't have to get chalitza from the other brothers. All you need, if the first one gave her a get, and then he gave her chalitza, then even if the second brother gave her also a get, she doesn't have to get chalitza from the other brothers. All she needs is chalitza from one of them. So l'cha'ora, if the Chachamim hold of zika, why not? She should have to get chalitza from the other brothers as well. So Amar l'cha Rabba Baravhuna bein l'Rabban Gamliel bein l'Rabbanan Savri ein zika. So the answer is no. Your assumption was wrong, that because Rabban Gamliel holds ein zika, that the Chachamim automatically have to disagree and hold yesh zika. No, both the Chachamim and Rabban Gamliel of our Mishnah hold ein zika. There's no such thing as this palpable zika, that just because you gave a weakened chalitza to the Yevama, she has to get chalitza from the other brothers. They don't hold of that either. But what's the machlokas between Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim? V'hacha beget achar get u'maimer achar maimer kamiflagi. The only machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Gamliel is, what is the status of a get after a get and a mimer after a mimer? That's the only issue of machlokas between the two of them. According to Rabbi Gamliel, a get after get is completely inconsequential, and the same thing with a mimer acher a mimer. And according to the Chachamim, a get after a get does create a partial severance. A mimer acher mimer does create a partial connection, and therefore the second person who presents the mimer, or the second woman who receives the mimer, is partially connected, and therefore you're usher to her relatives. Amar Mai, let's go back. Asa Maimer Bizu, that if the Yavam gives a mimer to A and then he gives a mimer to B, Rabbi Gamliel Omer no gate lo rishana b'cholei slava aser b'krova seho umuter b'krova shnia. So Rabbi Gamliel says, all you have to do is give a get and chalitza to the first one. The second one that you gave a mimer to is completely inconsequential. You don't have to do anything to create further severance, and you're allowed to marry her relatives. So mechti kasavar Rabbi Gamliel ein mimer achar mimer. So my question to you is very simple. If Rabbi Gamliel holds that there's no such thing as a mimer achar a mimer, so that when I gave A her mimer, then B, whatever I give to B as far as a mimer, is completely inconsequential. So Rishona Nami Tisyabe. So then why don't I let A go through? Let him go through with full yibum with A. Why are you telling me that no, once you gave A mimer and you gave B a mimer, you cannot consummate with A, but rather you have to give A get and chalitza? But why should that be? If this mimer to B was completely inconsequential, just go ahead and finish the act of yibum with A. Be totally married to her. The Gemara says the reason we don't allow it is gezerah dilma asi liyibume lishaniya. Because since the onlooker, it doesn't look right. The onlooker sees that he gave a mimer to A and a mimer to B. If we allow him to fully marry A, then the next time people will be confused and think that in such a case, not only could you do full-blown yibum to A, you could do full-blown yibum to B. And that for sure is not allowed, even according to Rabban Gamliel, because since he gave a mimer to A, then he's automatically precluded from ever doing Yibum to B. So in order to avoid that confusion, we never allow a case of full Bia, full Yibum, when you gave a mimer to both A and to B. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, so now Rabbi Yochanan makes a statement which tries to create an alignment of different Tanoim. Rabban Gamliel, and this we'll finish for today. Rabban Gamliel, Ubei Shammai, V'Reb Shimon, Uben Azai, V'Reb Nechemya, Kulu Svira Lahu Maimer Koine Kinyan Gomer. Now, all of these Tanoim, now I want to be very, very clear. All of these Tanoim are not aligned exactly according to halacha, but they share a common link to each other. What is their common link? That according to all of them, a mimer creates an effective deflection to one degree or another. That's all Rabbi Yochanan is trying to point out to us. That each one of these Tanoim holds that once you give a woman a mimer, you've successfully created some deflective power from another Yevama or from another Yavam. And we're going to see this as we go on. Now clearly, Beis Shammai and Rabban Gamliel do not agree with each other on every single aspect, because as we know, Beis Shammai hold that a mimer creates a kinyan midioraisa. And according to Rabban Gamliel, he agrees to Beis Hillel that a mimer only creates a kinyan midorabanan. So that's just one example of how you see that Rabbi Yochanan is not saying they all hold of the same halacha. They hold of different halachas, but they all share one thing in common, which is that a mimer has the ability to deflect. So let's see. Rabban Gamliel hada amra. And what's Rabban Gamliel? We just said that once you give a mimer to A, you've deflected the efficacy of a mimer to be given to B. It's completely inconsequential. Let's look at Beis Shammai. Ditnan shlosha achin shnai mehem nesum l'shtei achayos ve'echad mufna. Our famous case that we saw in the second parak, where you have three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters, and Levi's a single guy. So meis echad mibalei achayos v'asa ba mufna maimer v'achar kach meis achiv hasheni. So the case is as follows: Reuven dies, and sister A falls to Yibum, and Levi goes ahead and gives her a mimer. So we know that according to Beis Hillel, and then Shimon dies, and the other sister B, falls to Yibum. According to Beis Hillel, since a mimer is not a full kinyan, therefore he's stuck. He can't do Yibum to A, he can't do Yibum to B, because they're both achos zikukaso to some degree, right? So therefore you got to give a get to both of them and give chalitza to both of them, and you're stuck, according to Beis Hillel. However, according to Beis Shammai omrim ishto imo v'halazu teitze mishum achos isha. But Beis Shammai disagree. They say that a mimer creates a full-blown kinyan gomer, a full-blown marriage between you and the first Yevama, so that by the time Shimon dies and the Yevama's sister falls to Yibum, she's already achos ishto. And therefore there's no zika whatsoever to the second sister. So what do you see clearly? You see that according to Beis Shammai, a mimer has this deflective power. But of course, he's not holding the same way as Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel only holds that a mimer deflects another mimer. But Beis Shammai hold that a mimer deflects even a full-blown zika from the sister, right? Because it's a full marriage. Okay, now what's Reb Shimon? Reb Shimon Detanya, Amar Lahem, Rabbi Shimon Lachachamim, in Bias Rishon, Bia Sheni, Eina Bia, in Bias Rishon, Eina Bia Sheni, Nami, Eina Bia. So you have to understand, we're talking about a case which we haven't seen yet. We're going to see it in about 20 or 30 blot, or 40 blot. The case is as follows. A Bias Katan, a minor, a child who's 9 years old or older, but he's under bar mitzvah. So he's a katan, so he's not able to be kona and isha. But nevertheless, his bia is a valid bia. So what we do is we assign him the status of it's like a mimer. His bia is like a mimer. So now what would happen if you have a woman falls to Yibum to twin brothers who are both 9 years old? Okay? The first twin has bia with her, and he's kona her. He's kona her for sure, at least midirabanan. Then the second one has bia with her. So according to the Chachamim, she needs to get a severance. She needs to get rid of both of them. She needs to get a get and she needs to get, basically, the mimer creates a foothold for both of them to be connected to her, and therefore she's puzzled to the both of them. She's going to need to get a get from both of them, and she'll need to get chalitza from one of them. According to Reb Shimon, he disagrees completely, and he says no. Mimon afshach, no matter how you look at it, either the bia of a katan is a valid bia, in which case the second one's bia is no good at all, or the second or bia is not a kinyan for a katan, in which case the first one's bia is nothing, and the second one's bia is nothing. So no matter how you look at it, the second kid's bia is absolutely nothing. So Rashi just asks a question. One second. If the first one does a bia, and he's married to her because it's a kinyan, so then the second one's bia is an act of znus. So she should be usher to the first one because she's a zona. She was mizana. So Rashi gives a bizarre answer, which we won't have time to analyze, but Tosfos explains that the reason is because she was b'shogeg. Remember, I told you they're twins, right? So she thinks that she's having relations with the first kid because it's an identical twin. So that's the reason why she's not usher to the first kid. Okay, but in any event, you see, what do you see from Reb Shimon? You see from Reb Shimon that he looks at the second bia as being completely inconsequential, and the Gemara speaks out. He says, he says, "V'ha bias ben teisha dechamaimer shavua rabbanan ukamer Reb Shimon eina bia." Now the rabbis say that a bias katan, the intimacy of a minor, is like a mimer. And if it's like a mimer, then it's like a mimer acher mimer. And just like Reb Shimon says that a bias katan after a bias katan is inconsequential, so too Rabbi Gamliel says a mimer acher a mimer is inconsequential. So you see that they're aligned in this respect. Ben Azai, what's Ben Azai Shita? The Tanya Ben Azai Omer yesh mimer acher mimer b'shnei yevamim v'yevama echas ve'ein mimer acher mimer b'shnei yevamos v'yavam echad. See, he agrees with Rabbi Gamliel in one respect, and disagrees with Rabbi Gamliel in another respect. Ben Azai says, I hold like the Chachamim when you have two Yavams and one Yevama. That if the first Yavam, Shimon gives a mimer, and then Levi gives a mimer to the same woman, then both of them have a foothold, and therefore both of them need to give her a get, and one of them has to give her chalitza, but they're usher to, both of them are usher to her relatives. But I agree with Rabbi Gamliel that when there are two Yevamas, and one Yavam and one man, one brother, then if Shimon gives a mimer to A and then he gives a mimer to B, I agree with Rabbi Gamliel that B is completely inconsequential and therefore the Yavam is permitted to her relatives. Once again, you see that the mimer has deflective power. It has limited deflective power because Ben Azai doesn't agree with Rabbi Gamliel in the opposing case where there are two Yavams and one Yavama, but at least he agrees that it has deflective power when there's one Yavam and two Yavamas. And Rabbi Nechemya, what's Rabbi Nechemya Shita? Did not Rabbi Nechemya Omer, Echas Be'ila, Ve'echas Chalitza, Bein Betchila, Bein Be'emsa, Bein Besof, Ein Achareha Klum. He says it doesn't. Now, Rabbi Nechemya is quoted in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had said that when you have three Yevamas, A, B, and C, and A you give a mimer to, B you give bia, and C you give a get. So both the Rabbanan and Rabbi Gamliel had seemingly agreed that you've stigmatized all three women and you're usher to all three Yevama's relatives. Rabbi Nechemya disagrees, however, and he says that C will always be okay. Whatever you do to C is inconsequential. So the question is, V'habia pesula dechamar shavura rabbanan ukatani acharei klum. Now, what is the reason for Rabbi Nechemya? Because he says that a bia pesula, a bia that comes after you gave a get or a mimer to A, is a weakened bia in some sense. It's not therefore considered a full-blown bia, and therefore it's like a mimer. And yet, so what do you see? He says that a mimer has this deflective power to protect the woman that comes after her from being stigmatized at all, from any further action. Once again, you see that a mimer has this deflective power. And this is where we'll hold it for today. I hope I've tried to simplify it as much as I could.